In the 19th century, as Americans pushed westward across the continent, the expansion of the United States stirred up intense political and moral debates, particularly over slavery. While Manifest Destiny promised growth and prosperity, it also brought the nation face to face with the troubling question: should slavery expand along with America's borders? The struggle to answer this question tore at the fabric of the nation, setting the stage for the Civil War. Today, we're exploring how Manifest Destiny fueled the debate over slavery and ignited tensions that would ultimately reshape the United States. Welcome to the Great Empires. Today, we're diving into the connection between Manifest Destiny and the slavery debate, a complex relationship that influenced American politics and eventually led to the Civil War. We'll look at key events like the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and show how the question of slavery complicated America's vision of expansion. If you're interested in more explorations of history's pivotal moments, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Manifest Destiny was a powerful ideology that convinced Americans they were destined to expand westward across the continent, spreading their way of life. But this expansion raised a divisive question: would new territories be slave states or free states? As America expanded, the issue of slavery intensified, driving political conflict and moral debate. This video will cover how the Missouri Compromise temporarily balanced the interests of free and slave states, how the Compromise of 1850 reignited sectional tensions, how the Kansas-Nebraska Act pushed the nation toward violent conflict, and how these events created divisions that eventually led to the Civil War. Let's start with how the westward push led to the first major conflict over slavery, the Missouri Compromise. As America expanded, so did the question of slavery's place in the nation. This issue first reached a boiling point in 1819, when Missouri applied for statehood. Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, but this request posed a problem. At that time, the U.S. had an equal number of free and slave states, 11 of each. Admitting Missouri as a slave state would upset this delicate balance, giving the South more power in Congress. The debate over Missouri's status led to a heated argument between Northern and Southern lawmakers. Northerners feared that allowing slavery to spread westward would give the South an advantage, strengthening the institution of slavery and its political influence. Southerners, however, saw slavery as essential to their economic survival and believed they had the right to expand it into new territories. To avoid a full-scale crisis, Congress crafted a solution called the Missouri Compromise. Under this agreement, Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, while Maine, previously part of Massachusetts, would enter as a free state, preserving the balance between North and South. Additionally, the compromise established a dividing line at the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel. Territories north of this line would be free, while those south could allow slavery. The Missouri Compromise temporarily settled the question of slavery in new territories. However, it also revealed just how contentious the issue was. This compromise created an uneasy peace between free and slave states. But as America continued to push westward, it was clear that this peace couldn't last forever. As the idea of Manifest Destiny took hold in the 1830s and 1840s, Americans became more determined than ever to expand westward. Many believed it was their divine right to spread democracy and civilization across North America. But this expansion raised a pressing question: would slavery be allowed in these new lands? The United States acquired vast amounts of territory through treaties, purchases, and wars, such as the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and the Mexican-American War in 1846 to 1848. These acquisitions nearly doubled the nation's size, creating opportunities for settlers but also renewing the conflict over slavery. Southern states saw expansion as a chance to extend their way of life, which depended on slavery. In their view, if they could expand slavery westward, they could maintain political influence and secure their economic interests. Meanwhile, many Northerners were increasingly opposed to the spread of slavery, believing it was morally wrong and that it threatened the free labor system. As the country grew, the line established by the Missouri Compromise seemed increasingly inadequate. It only applied to territories within the old Louisiana Purchase, leaving vast areas of the new Southwest without clear guidelines. As settlers and politicians debated the fate of these new territories, sectional tensions began to intensify. This growing divide led to the next major political compromise over slavery, the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was born out of necessity after the United States acquired land from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the Mexican-American War. The question of whether slavery should expand into these newly acquired territories sparked fierce debate. The balance between free and slave states was once again at stake. California quickly became a focal point. In 1849, it applied for statehood as a free state, which alarmed the South. Admitting California as a free state would upset the balance in favor of the North. Southerners feared this shift in power and demanded protections for slavery in the new territories. To resolve the crisis, Congress crafted a complex package of laws known as the Compromise of 1850. The compromise had 5 main parts. California would be admitted as a free state, tipping the balance in favor of the North. Popular sovereignty would determine the status of slavery in Utah and New Mexico, meaning settlers in those territories would vote on whether to allow slavery. A stronger Fugitive Slave Act would be enforced, requiring Northerners to return runaway slaves to their Southern owners. The slave trade, but not slavery itself, was abolished in Washington, D.C. Texas was compensated for giving up land claims in New Mexico. The Compromise of 1850 was intended to calm tensions, but it only deepened the divide. While California's admission as a free state was a victory for the North, the strengthened Fugitive Slave Act enraged abolitionists. This law forced Northerners to participate in the enforcement of slavery, even if they opposed it. Many were horrified by the stories of free black people being kidnapped and forced into slavery under the law's broad powers. In the South, the compromise was viewed as a necessary concession, but many felt their way of life was increasingly under threat. The solution of popular sovereignty also proved problematic, as it opened the door for more conflict in the territories. The Compromise of 1850 postponed open conflict, but it couldn't resolve the underlying issue. The sectional tension was now more intense than ever, and the question of slavery in new territories remained unresolved. These tensions would reach a breaking point with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, hoping to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska for settlement. Douglas wanted to build a transcontinental railroad through the region, but he needed Southern support to pass his bill. To gain that support, Douglas introduced a controversial proposal. Instead of following the Missouri Compromise line, he suggested that popular sovereignty should determine whether Kansas and Nebraska would allow slavery. This meant that settlers in these territories could vote on the issue, effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise line that had kept the peace for over 3 decades. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, but it unleashed a storm of violence and chaos. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters flooded into Kansas, hoping to sway the vote. The result was a period of violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. Rival governments were established, one pro-slavery and one anti-slavery, each claiming legitimacy. Clashes erupted, leading to bloodshed as settlers fought to determine the state's future. One of the most infamous incidents was the Pottawatomie Massacre, where abolitionist John Brown and his followers killed 5 pro-slavery settlers in response to a pro-slavery raid on the anti-slavery town of Lawrence, Kansas. Brown's actions shocked the nation, but he became a hero to some abolitionists who saw him as a symbol of resistance to slavery. The violence in Kansas underscored the deep divisions over slavery and showed that popular sovereignty was not a viable solution. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had opened the door to conflict, and it was clear that the nation was moving closer to a breaking point. By the late 1850s, it was clear that compromises over slavery were no longer effective. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act had all tried to balance the interests of the North and South, but each had ultimately deepened the nation's divisions. The events in Kansas made it clear that the United States could no longer ignore the issue of slavery. Political compromise had failed, and public opinion was becoming increasingly polarized. The rise of the abolitionist movement in the North and the growing defense of slavery in the South hardened attitudes on both sides. In 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision further inflamed tensions. The court ruled that African Americans were not U.S. citizens and had no rights, and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in the territories. This decision invalidated the Missouri Compromise and left Northerners outraged, as it suggested that slavery could spread throughout the entire country. As the 1860 presidential election approached, the divisions over slavery reached a fever pitch. The Republican Party, led by Abraham Lincoln, opposed the spread of slavery into new territories. The South, fearing that a Republican president would threaten the institution of slavery, warned that they would secede if Lincoln were elected. When Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, the South followed through on its threat. Southern states began to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The election of Lincoln, combined with years of unresolved tensions over slavery, led to the secession crisis, and ultimately the Civil War. The vision of Manifest Destiny had promised a unified nation stretching from coast to coast, but it also forced Americans to confront the fundamental contradiction of slavery. As new territories were added, the struggle over whether they would permit slavery deepened sectional divisions, pushing the nation towards civil conflict. The compromises of the 19th century had only postponed the inevitable, and the violence in Kansas and the Dred Scott decision made it clear that the United States could no longer compromise on slavery.